Chapter 7 The crisis of perception. Faith seeketh, the intellect findeth. Unless ye shall have believed, ye shall not understand. For there are some things which we do not believe unless we come to understand them, and there are others which we do not understand unless we choose to believe them. Our intelligence is therefore suitable for understanding whatsoever it believes, and our faith is suitable for believing the things it understands. St. Augustine. It is an error to seek historical analogies for our modern situation, and accept it stoically. It is true that the rhythm of world history displays a multiplicity of different cultures dissolving and following each other. But the world is now united, and its peoples have a common destiny, and if today we are in a period of decline, it is a decline in world culture. So long as the multiplicity and the fluid succession of different cultures continued, it meant that a new chapter of world history could begin. And it could continue so long as it was confined to a few illuminated points on the globe. Vast reserves could periodically stream into the light of historical consciousness. Today the reserves of space have been exhausted and humanity is a collective body within the framework of a united culture which has embraced the whole world. Mankind has stepped into the light of historical consciousness, which means the end of history as it has hitherto been known. Consciously or unconsciously, world history has lived on the conviction that it has been moving onwards toward the unity of the world and mankind. This goal has now been reached. The next few decades will write the final lines of the book. And what then? Once the goal has been reached, man collapses into the sobriety of the finite. And it will induce the greatest crisis of all humanity. Already it is casting the first shadows of its coming. The people of the West observe them, and many are dreaming of fleeing into the New World of America, or to the periphery of South Africa or Australia, in any case of fleeing to some new place, which still has a future. For European man, this flight into the future is nothing but a flight from his actual present into the past. With a dim suspicion that he has had it, he seeks for places and peoples where he can forget his finiteness. The flight leads nowhere, for quite soon he will have had all the other spaces and peoples. And the man who has once experienced the shock of the finite never quite recovers. He has lost his first fine careless rapture, and amid accelerated dynamics and increasing speed will be unable to forget that he is quite close to finiteness. Anyone who quits Europe today is shutting himself off from the advance guard of humanity. The wider world is beginning to notice these first shadows of finitude, for which reason it casts the network of its giant planes against the canvas of heaven, and is dreaming of rockets and spaceships driven by atomic energy, to whiz from the Earth's surface to the moon, to colonize strange stars. These attempts will certainly be made, and it is possible that they will succeed. But what success can they have? Only the success of leaving man an imaginative gap through which he can escape the finite which is closing about him. If the unity of mankind is attained, man will experience it as the end of world history, that road leading through the centuries to the unification of the world. On the horizontal, man has reached his goal, and therefore comes to an end. Of course that does not mean an end of the events so meticulously entered in the history books. So long as mankind and the world go on, there will be rulers and ruled, poor and rich, warlike and peaceful peoples. There will be happy and unhappy, brilliant and murky epochs. But history will have lost its old sense. It will revert from the dynamics of directed movement and the form of a straight line to the cycle of events and the form of circle, unless before the wall of the finite man is directly touched from the vertical, and lifted onto a different plane of being. Later generations may wonder at the blind enthusiasm with which men offered all their strength to secure the unity of the world within the framework of a technical culture, and at the immense force of inner asceticism required for the purpose. Before the wall of finitude, each individual must ask himself to what extent he can release in himself forces so long buried that he was almost unaware of their existence, and according to the answer he will reach a new level of life or collapse before the barrier of his finiteness. All humanity is being summoned to judgment. We are at a terminal period, confronting something quite new and different. And the bridge between the old and the new runs through every man. Anyone still capable of being honest with himself will admit this in the embarrassing moments of self-examination, and in the measure to which he admits it, has begun growing. Man's position today is one of deadly earnestness. For 3 decades and more he has been bumping his head seeking a way out of a vicious circle. He bumps his head against the autonomous and reasonable being he believes himself to be. He succeeds in finding ways that promise an escape from the crisis, and even carries them out at times. But the result is always the same. His every attempt, made in all good faith, ends by making the crisis worse, more acute. An alien and mysterious power seems to be turning everything he undertakes the wrong way round, transmuting reason into nonsense, and beneficence into injury. Something behind his consciousness appears to mock his most thoughtful efforts and suggest ideas which do not modify the crisis but heighten it, so that the man begins to doubt himself and to fall into desperation. Is that what the crisis really means, leading men into a state of despair? That is exactly what it does mean. For it is despair alone which can move a man to question and test the things on which he has based his life. The premises from which man advances are false, and so the conclusion must always turn out wrong. His error lies in assuming that he is an individual advancing to meet the crisis when he sets the apparatus of his thought in action, which is by no means the case. For the consciousness which he bears within him is but the mirror reflection of the external culture and is sustained by it. It is reciprocal to the culture and inseparable from it. His ego is created and conditioned by the many items of his culture on which he can count, and which he can display and demonstrate. It is not something in opposition to the culture, but is the culture itself. Hence the vicious circle arises that the man is born by the very forces he is supposed to perceive, is obsessed by what he is supposed to possess. A large society composed of first-class human beings, writes C.G. Jung, resembles in morality and intelligence a large stupid and violent animal. That is to say, the bigger the organizations are, the more inevitable their immorality and blind stupidity. Senatus bestia, senators boni viri, the Senate is a beast, the senators are good men. For the development of personality a drastic separation from the collective soul is an absolute necessity, for every incomplete separation leads to the immediate dissolution of the individual. In the collective body, C.G. Jung, relations between the ego and the unconscious. The demonic urges which the collective unconscious throws up eruptively to the surface of consciousness are served by thought and, given the character of ideas, they seethe and boil over more violently the nearer the collective body draws to the end of the present phase of history. Like a mighty spring flood, the body collective beats with the waves of its worldly and material expectation on the wall of the finite, and as new forces surge on there is raging seething mass before it. In the course of his history man has survived many crises and sent catastrophes. But the historical crisis today is unprecedented. For its course and dimensions spring entirely from the will of man. It is not due to convulsions of nature. Man has raised it up and steers it, and now has fearful cosmic powers to do his bidding, capable of destroying the planet itself, and whereas earlier crises had but partial significance in the overlapping and succession of cultures, this is the first total crisis embracing mankind as a whole. Moreover, man is not only producing and directing catastrophe, but is consciously observing its phases, much in the manner of a doctor who observes the burgeoning of a cancerous growth in his body, and follows his own degeneration quite clearly. If the crisis were recognized as one of perception, there is a chance that events would register not in human consciousness but in conscience, instead of being functionaries of the collective body. Men might then once more become individual persons. 2q. The theory of perception upon which modern man has depended originated from natural science in its effort to come to terms with the external world. Its postulates have been already described. In place of the living plenitude of nature and the universe, with which man is vitally bound up and works reciprocally, we have a dead apparatus, a piece of mechanism working under immutable laws, capable of being represented in mathematical formulae, a mechanism above which human consciousness, but only human consciousness, not man as a vital and spiritual totality, can freely rise. So long as the opposite or object of observation is lifeless, a quantity convertible into numbers, and the book of nature, to quote Galileo, is written in mathematical language, it can be grasped in mathematical formulae and subjected to mathematical laws. Rationalism has always been founded on mathematics, on the ratio et veritas numeri. Reason and the truth of the number. The method is clearly shown in the approach of the Renaissance painter to his object. Albrecht Dürer has depicted it in his Draftsman. With the perspective frame between the object and the eye, which is fixed by an adjustable visor, a grid made of wires is suspended vertically in the plane where the picture would be. The image appearing herein, with its individual points fixed in that plane by the network, can now be transferred onto a drawing board provided with a corresponding grid. By means of this optico-geometrical relationship of the bodily forms on that plane, the eye is trained to see the tridimensional bodily form in an isolated vision as a flat image. Thus the geometrical faculty works retroactively upon the representational faculty and defines its forms. By means of it the object is apprehended visually in its overall spatial stature. The representational rules of formal correctness are only a means of perceiving the objective correctness. It is by means of this orderly fixation that the subject-object relationship is first spatially determined and defined. De Frey, Gothic and Renaissance. Between the object to be observed and the subject, which is the observer, the artist interposes his wire grid apparatus. Thrust between subject and object, breaking through and breaking off the immediate and direct connection between the two. It is an allegory of the whole method of perception with which, since the Italian Renaissance, man has been approaching and seeking to take possession of the object. Natural science cannot work with nature and the universe as man experiences them in their completeness and as he stands in a relationship of reciprocal exchange with them. It thrusts the wire grid of mathematics between man and nature, and the grid becomes ever more concrete in appearance, as in Albrecht Dürer's design. The more numerous are the bits of apparatus interposed, the perspective grid of the Renaissance draftsman has today expanded into the vestmensuration apparatus with which technical physics does its work. The course of development runs, as Max Spence describes it, from concrete and immediate nature to an apparatus-bound nature, from this apparatus-bound nature to abstract nature, and from abstract nature to the concrete mensuration apparatus of technical physics. Max Spence outlines of an intellectual history of mathematics. This development is possible so long as the object remains lifeless and adaptable to mathematics. It becomes illusory when the object refuses to fit into the mathematical method, as atom physics finds today. For the atom manifesting itself now as a wave, now as a corpuscle, no apparitional form can be fixed. It has introduced concepts like imprecision, inaccuracy, indefinableness, and probability into the clarified world of mathematics. Mathematics can indeed still do some work with them, but they do not correspond at all to its real nature. And the wire grid is becoming dubious. The apparatus is obviously influencing the nature of the object, which thus no longer exists in complete independence from the observer, but has already entered into contact with him through the apparatus, so that subject and object meld together in the concept of experimental reality. And the theory of relativity mathematics loses its absolute character as truth in itself, and is revealed in multidimensional calculations as a function, an instrument, upon which man can certainly play if he knows what he wants to play, but which cannot of itself provide him with a melody. It therefore evinces only a subservient character. Above all, it is the man who changes the subject, the observer who stands behind the apparatus and affects the object through it, for when all is said and done he is the special factor of imprecision and indefinableness which is today breaking as a demon into the world of artifice erected on the foundation of classical physics. For the artificial world erected on an abstraction could function only if it were served and populated by beings just as abstract, and in order to reach this state man would have had to submit himself under the whip of the apparatus to an enormous asceticism. The intelligible asceticism of our physical science is manifest, Max Pinze writes. If we assume that the sociological world of Laplace's demon is a world of total technique, it is clear that a still further increased inner-worldly asceticism will be inevitable. How then should not the sociological structure, also in a world where a science of the highest intelligible asceticism is presupposed, be also distinguished by a heightened inner-worldly asceticism? Max Pinze, Outlines of an Intellectual History of Mathematics. The artificial world of abstraction would have had to create a new type, the abstract human, each individual educating himself through the sternest asceticism. In the work of the brothers Zehrer this abstract world and its inhabitants are outlined in visionary form. Ernst Zehrer in The Worker describing the new human type, and Friedrich Georg Zehrer in The Perfection of Technique describing the world in which he would have to live. Nth Worker. Amidst extreme privation the feeling for the great tasks of life increases, writes Ernst Zehrer. It suffices to consider our life in its full unshackling and in its pitiless discipline, with its smoking and glowing districts, with the physics and metaphysics of its traffic, its motors, airplanes and million inhabitant towns, to begin to suspect with a feeling of horror mixed with desire that there is not an atom here that is not at work, and we ourselves are deeply committed to this process. So it comes to pass that wars of the knights, the kings, the citizens, are followed by the wars of the worker. Friedrich Georg Zehrer is well able to see the tendency towards perfection which is native to technique, but at the same time sees its limits. The wasteful rough cast mining without which it is unthinkable. The brutal and careless consumption of persons and means cannot be carried on as a long-term policy. It ends with the exhaustion of the objects to the consumption of which technical progress is directed. Contrary calculations omit to notice that one of the objects consumed by technical progress is man himself. They do not take account of the fact that there are limits to the development of mechanics, because there is bound up therewith a multiplication of elemental forces which directs itself destructively against man and the world of mechanics. The crisis in the mechanism of our artificial world, erected as that world was on the basis of classical physics, is the expression of man's inability to abstract himself sufficiently to be able to keep the technical machinery in action. Yet it is natural that in the midst of the darkness which overhangs his consciousness and clouds his whole existence, he cleaves to what formerly guaranteed his consciousness. Albeit the consequences are such as to suggest the ravings of a lunatic, human service of the apparatus is likely to be imposed with all the resources of tyranny and terror by those who have responsibly occupied the apparatus, and as its understrappers have to make of man the lifeless atom for maintaining and extending the mechanism of the technical world of civilization, founded on classical Physics. The physical atom has proved to be an enigmatic something which has destroyed the mechanism of classical physics. Atom Man is also revealing himself as enigmatic. On the one side he is disquietingly active and vital, a dark demonic creature, while he yet continues the method of rationalism and mechanism, and so doing becomes an object of compulsion and terror. Basically speaking, we have no theory of perception. We only have faith in the power of our consciousness, supposed to have a natural capacity for perceiving whatever goes on around us or within us. This faith is supported solely on the mathematico-experimental method of natural science, and on the truth and reasonableness of number, not by way of any supposed mastery over the laws and rules of number, which are understood only by a few hundred men in the whole world, and apparently no longer mastered individually, but through their collective work. The tangible wonder of the machine, however, is still able to confirm man's belief in the power of human consciousness. Galileo and Descartes influenced only an esoteric minority, specially devoted to thought. From their ideas the broad masses could draw no conclusions. They only drew them after being shown the machine, as evidence of the correctness of rationalist ideas. They then drew conclusions promptly and with a vengeance. Hence, when rationalism dreamed of the mathesis universalis to contain in itself the whole of truth, it was difficult for the voices of objection to make themselves heard. Swift and Pascal, Berkeley and Goethe protested against the predominance of number. After I had begun the study of man, wrote Pascal, himself a mathematical genius, I perceived that pure scientific knowledge is not suitable to men, and that I made more mistakes about my state in the world while studying it than those who knew nothing at all about it. I honor mathematics, said Goethe, as the most adroit and useful science, so long as men only use it in its place, but I cannot approve when people insist on misusing it on things which do not enter into the realm of mathematics at all, when noble science itself at once appears to be nonsense. Schopenhauer's view is sharper still, to the effect that the lowest of all mental activities is that of arithmetic, proved by its being the only one capable of being done by a machine as well. The mathematical enthusiasm of the 17th and 18th centuries had already fallen into decline in the 19th century, when the science of history stepped more strongly into the foreground. As we have already seen, it mobilized progress optimism, the secularized heritage of Christian faith, and thus gave man an additional security and directed him towards the future. In the process, rationalism and the science of evaluating percentages of truth borrowed from the philosophy of history, and their ideas were transformed into isms, till finally in the 20th century they turned directly into myths, and revealed their daimonic character. Mathematics have lost their claim to absoluteness. They have again become what they always were, an instrument of human consciousness, which man can certainly use most advantageously, but which cannot interpret and illumine his own nature to him, so that to base human interest upon it is quite illusory. All of which was simply expressed by Pascal. Knowledge of circumstantial matters will never comfort us in times of trouble, for an ignorance of morals, but a knowledge of the moralities will constantly comfort us for ignorance of circumstantial matters. Kierkegaard set against rationalism the whole vital existence of man, the way of objective truth, mathematics, metaphysics. Historical knowledge of different kinds leads away from the subject, he writes, all essential perception touches upon existence, or, to put it another way, only perception which has a real relationship to existence, is real perception. Perception which is not concerned with the inward turned reflection of the inwardness of existence, is in essence but casual perception. And its degree and scope are essentially a matter of indifference. Only ethical and ethico-religious perceptions have a real relationship to the perceptor's actual existence. so long as rationalism was sustained by the religious heritage of the masses which it admittedly exposed to skepticism, so long could it also trail the illusion of a mathesis universalis. As the 19th century released the broad masses from the unconscious security of the religious heritage, and it fell to science to assume responsibility for man in the totality of his being and to provide him with the foundations for his existence, these illusions burst like soap bubbles. Science then pulled out of the business at top speed and scattered itself in the splendid isolation of a supposedly intellectual world. The science of history sought to fill the gap, but could do so only by setting the popular church of progress in place of the heritage of Christian doctrine. In the last years of the 19th century, history fell into meaningless relativity, and offers no clear direction in the 20th century crisis. With the change in natural science and mathematics, and after the collapse of the science of history, man has lost the basis of his theory of perception without gaining another. 3. The crisis of perception strikes man from a point least expected. From that area wrested from nature where he has set up his artificial world. If man is to be lord of creation, it must be within the world he has himself created, and where he has realized his liberty. His dominating this world, as knowing it down to its smallest detail, has been a proposition of unquestioned validity for centuries. Medieval man held that from being emerges action, or, as the scholastic formula has it, operare sequitur esse. To work follows from being. The reverse is valid for modern man. Creation and action are the sole basis of being, that is to say esse sequitur operare. Work precedes being. The man who gives its features to the 1600 to 1900 period is Homo faber. But does man thoroughly know what he has himself made? At least among primitives the claim would not be valid, and we can no longer dismiss the world as senseless and unreasonable. Primitives, it has been earlier suggested, retain faculties which have become defective in our civilization, and while in some ways they are inferior to modern man, in others they are superior. Now, the primitive does not understand and perceptively know what he has himself made. On the contrary, the objects of ordinary use made by man retain their mystical qualities and have, according to the circumstances, a beneficent or harmful effect. This fact has been highlighted by Cushing. Cushing was a wonderful observer who lived among the Zunis, and persuaded them to let him share their communal life. He says the Zunis, like most primitive peoples, imagine manufactured articles to be alive in the nature of plants, of animals hibernating, or of human beings asleep. It is a kind of heavy and yet potent life, apt for passive resistance and indeed for a secret kind of active work inasmuch as it can bring forth both good and evil. And as the living beings known to them, like animals, have functions corresponding to their shapes, the bird has wings and flies, the fish has fins and swims, four-footed animals run and jump, so too the objects made by men's hands have numerous functions, all according to the shape they get. It follows thence that the tiniest detail in the shapes has its significance. Thus a difference in the end of the paws has the effect that the bear gets hold of his booty by hugging it while the panther seizes it by plunging his claws into it. In similar wise the powers of this or that domestic implement, such as bow, arrow, club or any other weapon, are bound up with every little detail of their shape, which must accordingly be meticulously copied when new ones are being finished. Furthermore the forms of objects do not only give them faculties but they also limit the nature and the measure of these faculties. If they are made as they should be, that is to say manufactured and dimensioned in the way that other objects of the sort always have been, the objects can be used with every confidence for the same service. The fish cannot fly with its fins nor the bird swim with its wings. In that case it would have to be a bird with feet, such as the duck has. In the same way an implement, a vessel of traditional shape, can only serve the traditional use of that vessel, and one will not have to fear unknown powers which might get into a new shape. La Vibrole, the souls of savages. According to Cushing, this explains the extraordinary permanence of shapes among primitive peoples, who avoid varying the tiniest detail even of the decorations of their work. That is not, as people have said, the effect of usage and a conservative spirit, but of an active faith in the mystical qualities of the objects which are bound up with their shapes and would immediately escape from man's control were the tiniest change made. Apparently insignificant variations may release hostile forces and finally bring to ruin their inventor and those who belong to him. The primitive therefore does not hold the view that he has perceived and understands, and thus fully mastered whatever he has himself made. The utensil he uses retains its own particular life and is full of dangers, and it is only by keeping exactly to the original form that he is to some extent safeguarded. This mental attitude has become completely alien to modern man. Not only does he hold that objects which he has himself made are lifeless and submissive to him, but he keeps demanding an endless change of shapes, seeks restlessly for novelties. He does so from a desire to display his possessions to his neighbors and obtain their approval, which he projects onto himself. The new dress, the new car, the new radio. The 1,001 products of civilization keep changing their shape to remain up to date, unprecedented, unique, and striking, which their owner can show and with which he can show off, in order to be assured by others that he is different and enviable, that this swift change of forms might be dangerous, because of his ignorance of them would seem to him a ludicrous suggestion. Nonetheless, it may not be unprofitable to test the sureness of his perceptive knowledge on a practical object in his instrument world. Let us take one with which everyone is familiar, the motor car. In the normal structure of civilization, the one condition for liberty is the possession of money. Having that, a man buys a car, learns in a few hours the necessary manual controls, obtains a driving license, sits at the wheel and whizzes through the world at from 15 to 20 times his natural speed. He knows the car, an instrument of civilization, fully and accurately. He knows how it works, how its components are put together, and that every disturbance must have an ascertainable cause. Yet if he were to demand a definitive explanation of all the forces active in his instrument, he would soon be out of his depth, for he would find himself in laboratories where physicists are busily working to reduce the dark forces and processes of nature to the cipher script of their concepts and figures, and if he pursued his inquiries far enough, he would be involved in the crisis which has seized upon natural science, and realize that his image of the car is far from possessing the clarity and assurance he imagines. Modern instruments do not arise from a final insight into the nature of the universe, from the perception of indivisible truth in the certainty of a clear world image, but are the result of innumerable acts of experimental daring, which have wrested from nature a few of her secrets without having opened up the whole interrelationship of her working powers. They arose from the a priori and not the essence. It is therefore far from certain that man really dominates the world of natural creation and can make use of it unpenalized. It is far from certain that by means of his a priori he will not one day be involved in an unknown field of force, and exposed to a cosmic repercussion, with disastrous consequences. Then his instruments would reveal themselves as animals hibernating, as drowsing men, whom to awaken would be to invite apocalyptic consequences. Only a few years ago man would have laughed at such a suggestion. The progress of atomic fission has given him better instruction, and he is beginning to look on the future with dread. Man does not know the ultimate background of the car, but he knows the system of law under which it stands. The rules and interrelationships of this strange inorganic life, which imitates the processes of natural life like eating, digesting, breathing, and the development of energy, are quite clear and comprehensible to him, and he would be right in claiming that he sees and knows what he has himself made. Yet it has not produced any true perceptive knowledge. Man's perceptive faculty has been developed by innumerable experiences on the long, thorny path the species has traveled over thousands of years. The most important task of his consciousness is to advise him as to the effects of his own conduct, and the effect upon him of the alien things around him, what they mean for him. Consciousness and perception have been built up from a long process of suffering. Daring to act against the will of nature, man exposed himself to the counter-strokes of nature, and learned from pain and suffering, thus courted where the true boundaries of liberty lie. Primitive man, handling his instruments as though they contained strange hibernating forces, is not behaving so illogically as it might seem. A succession of experiences has shown him that the instrument is a dangerous being whose power he cannot always control. Crazy as it seems to us that he should address his instrument, say an axe, before using it, the conjuration at least reminds him of the power of what he holds, and warns him that with this axe thing in his hand he must not yield to those impulses and emotions appropriate to his being when restricted to his own powers. By observation and experiment we have been able to bring an alien thing opposite us into a determinate system of figures and concepts. We master these alien things with the aid of our consciousness. And any kind of apprehension before their mysterious powers seems quite incomprehensible. The bigger the power of the thing, the greater the testimony to our consciousness, which has made it serviceable. All that, however, is nothing but abstract knowledge, concerning only some properties of the object. Perceptive knowledge of the object embraces a reciprocal backworking into the subject, answering the question, what does this alien thing mean to me, what effect upon me does it have? The primitive answers the question without difficulty, having perceptive knowledge without our massive abstract knowledge. Whereas we have little perception of things. To return to the example of the motor car, we have considerable knowledge of the thing in itself, which we have acquired to make use of it. In the relationship car-man, however, we are included only as conscious beings, not in the totality of all that we are as men. An understanding of what the car means for us is confined to the conscious I which we display to others, and which they confirm, independently of the fact that the style of the car influences social standing. It has great importance for the conscious ego. Through its power I increase my liberty. It conquers space for me, which means a gift of time. Man is conscious, however, only to a small extent of his total being. He is a conscious being, indeed, only to the extent to which he can abstract himself by excluding, by withdrawing his attention from the forces of his being which do not harmonize with the image he has made of himself. And they, once left to themselves, lose shape and stature, and in the form of demons become obsessive. The car places me as an unconscious totality amid quite other realities. While in it I lead quite another life and become quite another being. And I become this other, this car person, without myself being aware of the fact, for I am in no sense armed against the car, but enter it in my colossally unembarrassed naivete as the most natural thing in the world, while identifying myself with the image of my conscious ego, to which incidentally the car substantially contributes. I deliver myself without reserve to dark elemental forces, which grasp my unconscious nature, model it, and change it, while I as a conscious being keep my eyes on the road and on the instrument board. We settle down at the steering wheel and shoot off at 100 kilometers an hour or more through the countryside, allowing ourselves to be transported by forces many times exceeding the strength of our own beings. We rejoice in the speed. The rhythmical beat of the pistons is music to us. The road becomes a long white band to be consumed. And all of it, rhythm and tempo, the sense of power as the foot presses the accelerator and the hand turns the wheel, goes deep within us, and imperceptibly invites us from being a man to become a car fiend, that is to say, to become a creation of the instrument which we ourselves have made. Thus man becomes a car man, a quite different being. The demonic qualities of the car, without passing man's power conscious and self-satisfied consciousness, gain access to the unconscious and emotional depths of his being with somewhat sinister effect. The motorist will naturally point out how essential is a car existence. For he is living in an artificial world where space must be overcome and time saved. But the car can be shown in another causal nexus, about which the motorist likes to keep silent, because here he cannot appeal to professional necessity. Imagine two human beings, not necessarily young, surrendered to the magic of jazz, which releases them from the rhythm of the machine by physically completing it. Drink further loosens their control. They then set off in a car, switching on its radio and coupling the rhythm of the engine with that of the music. After driving wildly through a world which is all their own, they stop somewhere, and in a state of exaggerated power consciousness, surrender themselves to sexual contacts which are infantile and atavistic, and which, to judge from their birth certificates, they should have long outgrown. But innumerable crooners assure them that this is love, and they believe it for half an hour, to repeat the experience next evening with a new partner. Hear what is doing. The loving is not the human being, but the car being. Our age passes such occurrences with a self-complacent smirk and finds academic voyeurs in plenty who are ready to justify them as a healthy way to relieve tension. Every artist knows that his work acquires a life of its own once it is complete, separate, and placed opposite him. It is no longer an object, but has become a subject charged with forces, which in the work itself have found allegorical and symbolical form, but which spring from a living power beyond it and point above it to something which possesses no form. The artistic value of the work depends upon TTS revelation of this other power, and upon the nature of the other power, whether it is demonic or godlike, depends the quality of the work. The instruments of civilization possess today the liveliness which proceeds from art itself. They have energies which scarcely differ from those of real life, except in being many times stronger. They have become demons against whom human beings are in no wise prepared. "Oh, believe," says Berdyaev, "that the victorious progress of the machine is one of the greatest revolutions in human destiny. A kind of mysterious force, alien as it were to man, and indeed to nature, enters into human life, a kind of third element, which is not natural and which is not human, is gaining fearful power over man as well as over nature. This new and frightful force is disintegrating man's natural forms. It is subjecting the human being to a process of dismemberment and division, as a consequence of which man is as it were ceasing to be a natural creation, as he was erstwhile." In Berdyaev, The Sense of History. 4. It is almost impossible to make the modern understand that he has not perceived, or come to know through the world he lives in. How can I make it clear to a man who elegantly drives his car up to me that he is obsessed by, and not possessed of, his machine? He is in perfect agreement with me over the terrifying prospects of atomic and bacterial warfare, and we separate in the joint conviction that at almost any cost it must be avoided. Atomic and bacterial warfare, however, does not begin somewhere high up over our heads, but in the fact of both of us being obsessed by the dynamos of our instruments, both of us having between 15 and 30 times our natural power now at our disposal. Multiply this exaggerated increase in power by 2.5 milliards of men, and the result is atomic war. It may be that we discuss a speech of one of the unfortunate being called to lead mankind politically, who, from a clear insight into the causal connection of things, appeals to us to improve ourselves and work for peace. We both of us find this speech reasonable and good. And many share our view. We then, peacefully, leave each other. And my companion goes excitedly to the throttle and swings round a curve at 100 kilometers an hour. With that we promptly find ourselves a little nearer to atomic and bacterial warfare. It is the greatest error to suppose that we bombard the atom, it is atoms which bombard us. The decline begins with every switch a man turns on in consciousness of his power, every button he presses in consciousness of himself, and every lever he throws into circuit with an elegant grace. But suppose I try to make this clear to the man who steers his car. Uptom? His car is a part of the paraphernalia through which he displays himself and secures collective approval. His consciousness, grievously reduced by the prolonged crisis, is renewed and strengthened each time he spins again round a curve at top speed, as a magnificent creature that methodically carries out his bidding. The car is in no sense a problem challenging his cognition. Any insinuation that he lacks perception of his car and the artificial world of his creation strikes him as pure nonsense. It is difficult to make him understand that he knows the car only as a thing, for itself, but does not really have knowledge of it as the thing in itself. Since natural science has been using the mathematico-experimental method, man has employed the theory of perceptive knowledge. Based upon it, and it worked well up to the outbreak of the crisis. It could be promptly transmuted into deeds, and by the functioning of its products could at any moment produce evidence of its own truth. In this it differed so pleasantly from the truths of faith and the assertions of philosophy, which made demands of man without being able to give him visible and tangible security. For over 500 years Western perception has rested on the trick of interpolating mathematics, and by this process man's own ego was screened off in exactly the same way as was the nature of the power opposite, resulting in man appearing only as a conscious being opposite a mathematic object. With this trick the shell of technical civilization has been created. If today the trick seems to be losing its effect, and the modern perception theory seems inadequate, man knows no other. Perceptive knowledge is vitally necessary to man because he neither belongs to the instinctive animal world nor has there specialized bodily organs. He needs therefore the perception which will tell him enough about his own nature and the world in which he lives to make his existence secure, yet enable him as an individual, imperfect and unfinished, to get closer to his goal of completion. He can do nothing to change his incompleteness, he can only hope to make something of what is his destiny and bring it to a satisfactory conclusion. He senses the world of natural creation as alien, because, while dependent upon it, he is imperfectly adapted to it. A state of things he perceives with anguish. He seeks release by cutting himself away from the world surrounding and overpowering him, to meet it opposite him, and take possession of it. In the earliest stages of his development man is never in complete unity with the world around him, or he would possess no human qualities at all, for it is precisely the qualities of consciousness showing themselves in anguish which characterize him as human. The diffuse intermingling of inner world and circumstantial world appears almost to constitute a unity, at the most primitive levels. Anguish alone indicates that this unity is no longer present, but the opposition has arisen between subject and object, myself and the world, which is characteristic of consciousness. This is a long process, embracing numberless generations, during which man is transformed with the world around him. For escape from incarceration by his circumstantial world, and from being obsessed by things, frees him from the pain of anguish and secures him freedom. He advances to meet things opposite him, gives them names and sets them in the framework of an order. From the thou of objects opposite him arises retroactively the ego of the person, which constitutes his consciousness. Every Ego is determined by his many meetings with a thou, and the thou is always contained in the I as another dark half, lying in the shadows, just as the ego is always included in the thou. Consciousness is not a faculty conferred on man with the security and permanence of the other organs of his body, but is delivered to him as a function in relation to his circumjacent world. It is a matter of a dynamic and ever-present polar tension between subject and object, soul and world, which is affected and modified by change. In either of the two poles, the diffuse interfusion of spirit and world, which characterizes the zone of the magical, will give place to the clarity of opposition between subject and object, yet their basic interfusion goes on. Subject and object can be widely sundered in the field of tension, they can be tugged apart like the two ends of a rubber band and become strangers to each other. But it only needs a change in either of the poles to change the tension of their opposition. And with it the consciousness itself, only a sudden convulsion is needed to restore the rubber band, to revive the original diffuse interpenetration of soul and world around it, and to thrust man back again into the zone of the magical. In fact, it needs only a relatively tiny impulse to transform a man who has based himself on consciousness, and turn him into another person. Hence the reinsurance of his consciousness and the acquisition of perceptive knowledge become a permanent task for man. He can never affirm that he has fully carried out this task, attains certainty, and freed himself from anguish. Ever anew the circumjacent world thrusts in on him and threatens to overpower him and occupy him, and ever anew he has to shake himself loose of it and free himself, and take up a separate stand opposite to it. The prerequisite of consciousness and of perceptive knowledge is for the human soul to be overcome and obsessed by something. There is a unification, a mystical communion, in which the soul assumes and experiences and suffers the being of the alien. At this stage the soul is shaken by fear of the alien something, but suffers it totally, and only then begins the painful process of shaking loose the alien essence which, lodged within the soul, leads to feverish dreams and phantasmagoria, analogous to the processes when a foreign body has found its way into the physical organism and set up an infection. This shaking free from unification with the something alien is the second step in consciousness and perceptive knowledge. The soul wrestles with the alien essence which has taken possession of it. It draws back from it, unbecomes it, and pushes it away. It reduces it to a few of its qualities, classifies it, and gives it a name and a sign, and finally dismisses it cold and alien, and sets itself opposite. The names and signs are merely a cipher record of mighty experiences. They are the memory tabs for those aboriginal mystical experiences when the alien something was suffered in its totality and essence, and the perception of the alien something is valid only so long as these experiences are revived with its concept, so long as the resonance of the object is yet to be heard in the soul like the dull rumble of a distant thunderstorm. Consciousness and perceptive knowledge have always meant strife deep within man. The man perceptive is a person who is in a process of constant transformation and a state of continuing suffering. He lives between the two extremes of complete surrender to the alien something, even to the extent of utter self-surrender and unification, and of perfect liberation from it, and reversion to the clarity of being opposite. In contradistinction to primitive man, the man perceptive enters voluntarily into obsession, for at the later stage of human development, things are already separate from him. He yields himself to them, and allows himself to be occupied by them, to produce the mystical union of the primitive which has gone from modern man. The inner power with which he takes hold of the alien something opposite and embraces and absorbs it, is termed love Pete. Nothing resembles the secularized sweet stickiness often denoted by the term today, but is capable of penetrating an alien counterpart through and through. Every great love is the child of some great knowing, said Leonardo da Vinci. Love and reason, said Pascal, are one and the same thing. One does not learn to know anything save what one loves, wrote Goethe, and the deeper and more complete this knowing is to be, the stronger and mightier. And more lively must the love be, yea, and a painful passion too. Unification or identification with the alien opposite is, however, only the first phase of knowing. It certainly procures for man the essence, the nature, of the counterpart, but procures it in such a way that he himself becomes the object of an alien demonic subject. Consciousness is restored only when he succeeds in once more liberating himself and taking up a stand apart. Only then does the alien become an object of his perceptive knowledge. For so long as he is obsessed by it, he is still in the zone of the magical. How does primitive man free himself from the zone of the magical? Not as an individual but only through the collective body, the tribe or clan. It is as though anguish had fused men together, so that out of many human entities one large collective person arises, whom the dark floods of anguish no longer shatter. Within the body collective the diffuse interpenetration of soul and circumjacent world begins to separate, to assume clear outlines. As yet the subject is not as an individual but a collective creation, yet it is crystallizing out of itself the single man, the chief or priest or medicine man, displaying for the first time the contours of an individual person. The collective body makes the existence of such an individual possible and secure by subjecting itself to him, while he makes the collective body's existence secure by carrying out, as it were, the function of its brain. This is one side, external and social, of the process of releasing man from the zone of the magical, but it is not the most important. Primitive man lives in a world where the divine power manifests itself in everything and everyone. In all things mana or immunun is at work, and he attributes value to individual things and people according to the amount of mana they possess. Everywhere, within and at the back of all phenomena in his world, divine power hides, and all things therefore grow into living and godly demonic forces which become the object of his honors and rites and ceremonies. He does not see the alien being as itself, but sees the divine force in and behind it, and by approaching this divine force, which has at different times marked itself in innumerable sprites, daimons and gods, by submitting to them and honoring them, and thus communicating with them and coming to resemble them, he contrives that the significance of the alien entity for him is constantly made known, and thus made an object of consciousness. The more directly man approaches the divine in things and at the back of them, the farther the latter fades away from them and gives him the things as possessions, and yet the more, too, the divine condenses itself and the more clearly it reveals itself to him, until it allows him as individual man to recognize it in the divine form of the one God who stands behind all phenomena, who created the heaven and the earth, whose power penetrates and fills the whole of natural creation, and with whom the soul of man is most narrowly bound up. One may therefore say that the world is given to man in his consciousness only to the extent to which he approaches God, and that he is possessed of them only to the extent to which he has God. Primitive man's world of the magical is not basically so different from that of the Christian, though it possesses far greater clarity. Mana or Imyanu possesses numerous masks and guises in which it presents itself to primitive man. It is a fountain god, river god, tree god or mountain god. The Christian possesses knowledge of the one living God, who is in all things and reveals himself to the individual. For Luther, God is in all things, and all things in God. All creatures are God's masks and mummeries, he says. As prince and priest, teacher and pupil, grown up and child, as Lord and servant, does God carry on his work in this world. It is not we who act, but in truth it is he who acteth through us, and we are but masks of him, whereunder he hideth himself, and doeth all in all. In and behind all things doth God hide, he hath his being and worketh in things, but no thing is God himself. It is the Deus absconditus in revelato, God is hidden in the revealed, which is ever trying to abstract itself from man. When God becomes an idea, an abstract being, when he is only enthroned as the other one in the beyond, then this world is deprived of divine semblance and differs nothing from the rationalized world of the natural sciences, in which God is no longer needed even as an hypothesis. Upon the Christian level, man has reached the highest degree of consciousness in the one personal God. Only upon that level can he surrender himself devotedly to every person and everything, without danger of sinking into the world of the magical and becoming obsessed. For the one living and personal God abides in and is at the back of all persons and things, and his own personality is continually restored to him in ever richer forms. He loses himself, only to win himself again. He ever remains a person and the master of phenomena. At the primitive level, the collective body led by the chieftain provides the form of existence through which man liberates himself from anguish, and slowly learns to know and acquire the world immediately around him, by experiencing the living divinity in and behind persons and things. But the circumstantial world too, which contemporary man has adapted himself, is the artificial world of technical civilization. He is just as preoccupied by this world as primitive man is by that of natural creation, and reacts in the same way. But his world can give man only that which informs it. The world of natural creation imparted God as the animating cause behind all phenomena. The world of technical civilization will also deliver to man the ultimate cause and animating power behind all its phenomena, namely, man obsessed with the lust for power and grown fanatical, who has made this world and who can find nothing in it and behind it save himself. Innumerable human beings practicing extreme asceticism have, through centuries, given all their strength in collective cooperation to the end of obtaining power, nothing but power, out of the elements of such power the world of civilization was built up. Innumerable people all over the world are busy day and night working to increase the sources of power. It has been said that technical science is neutral, serving all alike, and having no special qualities of its own. That is untrue. A loaded gun awaiting only the lightest finger touch to spread destruction, an electrical switch needing but a slight turn to release enormous forces, such things are no longer neutral. For they have lowered the expenditure of the force required to produce the greatest effects. Something quite minimal is all that is needed, a tiny surge in someone's will to power. It is a serious matter for me to brain another man with a club. It is not so much to pick him off 100 meters or more away with the touch of my finger on a trigger. And it does not amount to anything too hidden, objective, which I see only as a heap of stones far beneath me, or do not see at all, but know only as it is indicated on my instruments. Though at a touch of my finger cosmic forces will be released through which millions of human beings will be annihilated, it does not mean a thing for me. I take due note of it subsequently with interest. I learn that the pressure of my finger has blotted out 1,200,000 people. Check up to see if this is a record, and go offer contentedly to breakfast. It is splitting hairs today to argue that technical science is neutral, that the technical civilization which man has built up is dead, that any single instrument is lifeless and without power of its own. Is self-evident. How dead the technical world really is becomes apparent only when for some reason or other it no longer functions. Yet it is swarming with demons of such numbers and power as heretofore have never been known in the world, so that the world of technical power constitutes the most devilish temptation to which man has been exposed throughout his millennial development. Certainly the technocrat can say with perfect truth, I have no power of my own. I merely serve man, and it is his to command in what manner I serve him. But, then, no power of his own has been given unto the devil, He merely has the power of temptation. But how demonically big the power of temptation has become, and what spiritual dimensions it presupposes for man to emerge unharmed. You have always the choice, says the technocratic devil, of resisting me and remaining pure. Choice, however, I no longer have, for during my life I have been totally adapted to and slipped into a world which is the devil's. I cannot take a step in it without being caught in a thousand snares and traps. What I basically need if I am not to stumble is profound meditation and prayer, yet when I stand, the body collective falls upon me and forces me into its Procrustean scheme or casts me into outer darkness. And throughout the whole process only one small concessive step is needed to be placed in the full enjoyment of power. Where, then, is the neutrality of power? It lures and tempts, and can be sure in advance of a 99% success. Behind the world of natural creation and man's every experience stands the hidden God, who appears in the numberless mummeries, masks and disguises, but with whom, as the final and supreme achievement of perceptive knowledge, man came face to face. Behind the world of artificial civilization and man's experiences, there stands man, who appears in the numerous mummeries, masks and disguises until he emerges in the final and supreme manifestation as the one living man God, the adversary, the in Christ as Luther calls him. If man does not succeed in liberating himself from the zone of the magical, he will run into a cosmic catastrophe compared with which our past and present troubles are not more than early squalls. Because he animates the world of technical civilization which he has made, man cannot directly perceive this world, like primitive man, as the world of natural creation where he is met by something living, by divine right. How can man, who has himself become God, draw near to himself, unless he can attain some vantage ground where he is no longer God? How and in what manner can he now escape from the zone of the magical and release himself from the demons by which he is obsessed when the demons have their residence within him? And where is he to find a vantage ground where he can meet himself face to face? In the world of natural creation man is embraced and borne up by God. In the world of technical civilization, he is embraced and borne up by himself. And how can a man who is enveloped by himself, that is to say, who has thrown his arms protectively around himself and is drawing them ever tighter, the more threateningly the crisis approaches and the thicker the blows fall, how can a man in that situation be moved to release himself? A change of situation is possible only through inner transformation. So long as he is himself God, he cannot perceive his world, being obsessed by it. To begin to see it, or even to have an inkling of it, is the first evidence of a process of inner change, of coming face to face with another by whom he is embraced and carried. If the formation of consciousness and perception can be fulfilled only upon the religious plane, and the whole experience of mankind supports this assumption, then contemporary man in his obsession must seek and find God anew. He discovered nature and the universe when he was able to set himself opposite them, face to face. We have explained that he obtained the strength for this from the Christian consciousness of mastery over nature, and from Christian asceticism in which he was cradled, both of which remained effective when he succumbed to temptation, released himself as an individual from the living counterpart of God opposite him, and set himself up as supreme instance with the confirmation of the body collective. The counterpart opposite him is no longer the world of nature and the universe, but the world of technical civilization, and to recognize it and himself within it, he must be able to get right outside it. To liberate himself he needs a consciousness of mastery and a powerful asceticism, which might as well be expressed by adapting St. Paul's saying, "Let those that drive cars, be as though they had none. Those who turn out goods and earn money, as though they produced and earned nothing, those who wear fine raiment, as though they wore them not, those who have the confirmation of the body collective, as though they despised it and had no need of it. Those who make use of the world of technical civilization, let them not misuse it, for the essence of this world passeth away. The demand made of man today is harder than anything he achieved at the Renaissance, when he inherited the Christian consciousness of mastery and the power amassed by centuries of asceticism. Today man finds nothing before him except his own despair and the void. Therein lies the desperateness of the present situation, but therein also is to be found a large measure of hope. As the being who means to hold what he has, he finds himself surrounded by despotism and terror, but liberty sometimes comes to men in the midst of fires and destruction, when they manage to get an inkling of what lies hidden behind events. The crisis remains meaningless if man tries to see the ruins and rubble through his ancient conceptions, and to integrate them in a consciousness which cannot forget what has been, and the world that is no more. The crisis leads man into the void, but it can give him back his liberty once he is able to maintain himself outside. For that is the cardinal question: how is man to maintain himself once he is no longer confirmed by the collective body or living in the security of its artificial world? It is, however, a question already addressed to God. For the moment man begins to quit his world, and himself with it as its creator and creation, he must seek out the lost opposite or counterpart God, as being the only power which can prop him and support him. For what is contemporary man if he inwardly renounces his productions, and no longer seeks confirmation from the collective body? The outside to contemporary man is sheer nothingness, a vacuum in which, in his present state, he cannot exist. Nobody can save him from this void, and anyone desirous of helping him to find God would not wish to do so. Having lost the apperception of God by traveling for half a millennium the path of autonomous consciousness, he must follow the path to the last limit, at which point his consciousness comes to an end and his awareness of God begins. As Pascal says, reason's last step is to recognize that infinitely much passes beyond it. It is very weak, if it does not succeed in this. Or, as Max Scheler expressed it, it is not by any external guidance of man to the idea and reality of God, whether by so-called proofs or by persuasion, that we shall find the way to remove what is called unbelief, but by some most certain indication that man has placed a finite good in the place of God, that is to say in the absolute sphere of his objective realm, which has been given him as a sphere of action against all eventualities, having idolized such a good thing, as the old mystics used to say, to create the proper disposition for the religious growth of personality. Smashing the idol is necessary for the long-lasting sense of deception and disappointment of setting the finite thing, such as the state, art, a woman, money, knowledge, and so on, in the place of God, or treating it as if it were God. There is always an especial reason in man's own life. If this reason be ascertained, the veil hiding the idea of God from his soul will be removed. The idol which has been placed between himself and God may be smashed, and the disrupted or misdirected order of being, the order of values in the heart, will be re-established in the sight of reason, and the dislocated religious action return of itself to the idea of God. The question of perception, which has for over 500 years been separated in the West from that of the perception of God, returns to its point of origin when man desires to illuminate the darkness in which he is lost. The question of the existence of the crisis turns into the question of his own existence. Instead of trying to force external events into the categories of his consciousness, his thought, once genuinely faced with the crisis, turns from external events inwards, for he recognizes that he is situated behind the crisis. that in fact he himself is the crisis. Politicians begin to say that man must change his nature, without having any means to effect such a change. For at the utmost they have force, but the exercise of force never compels the change needed. To eliminate the crisis, it works in the opposite direction, and increases the demonic reserve in men. No authority exists today so powerless as to be able to claim men's voluntary agreement and approval. The crisis advances upon mankind as an external event, but only when man turns away from external measures and directs his attention upon himself, will he encounter and eliminate the crisis within himself. He is unable to perceive himself as a total being, because such totality lies beyond his consciousness. On the other hand, he can no longer be borne farther by himself on the far side of consciousness. Because consciousness becomes relative and a function and instrument of being, he can therefore advance into that beyond only as he is borne by a power to which being and being conscious are one and the same, that is to say, the power which man has called God.